agree with me. That was a wonderful session with, I think, lots of issues raised from, I think, just almost the fundamental one of the power of portraiture in a way, but also the whole issue of authenticity in the object. Any questions first off? It's a very gentle one. Well, I've got one, two. Oh, no, sorry.
Thank you both for really beautiful and interesting papers. I have a question for Greg. Thank you for sharing that story, very personal and really interesting and moving. And I'm wondering, not that I expect a solution from you, but what are ways forward in terms of those busts? Is there a path towards kind of a reconciliation between all these interests and agendas that they've been caught up in? Or is that sort of still ongoing questions?
I think these are kind of organic processes that have their own lives, and we've had mention of Binyamin's contribution to that conversation, and I mentioned Baxendale. Of course, there's T.J. Clarke. There's lots of people have written on the importance of recognising how objects change in their perception and in their nature as they travel through time. There's kind of I think there's an interplay between the political campaign, which has a specific set of objectives, and then the response. And in the case of the Benjamin Law bust of Truganini and Warrady to a similar extent, and the political action in forcing their removal from auction and the consequent removal by institutions because of security concerns from display. That response, and then the following response from art historians who had something to say about this, and I mentioned David's important essay on this subject, and maybe even my response to the political act in relation to the engraving of the Demoutier. I used the word in my presentation, renovation. I like the word. I'm not sure whether it's quite the right word, but I like the idea that the nature of objects, the perception of objects, the reading and the valuing of objects, they don't just flow aimlessly through time. They can be subject to agency and steerage and impulse and personal interest, political interest. This is what makes art so bloody interesting. And I just wish that historians and people in Australia who are interested in history more generally would recognise that art objects, are just as important, sometimes more important than, some journal by, Governor Arthur or somebody else. We need to bolster our visual literacy and understand that subject of visual rhetoric as well.
Thanks very much for both of those papers. They were very enjoyable and challenging as well. I saw two of the three iterations of the National Picture Exhibition, and I know that material quite well. And just more as a personal response, that I find the Demoutier engraving very cold, very hard to look at. But both the busts, particularly in the installation, the higher installation, and the Bock portraits, so incredibly powerful to be able to look into the eyes. I think the way we perceive art, of course, changes. And the fact that, I grew up absolutely thinking with that awful myth that Truganini was the last of the Tasmanian Aboriginals. So to be able to have that sense of connection to those works, I find incredibly important for our future, and I'd be devastated if you couldn't. If you couldn't make that connection and learn from it as well. So that's more of an observation than anything else.
Yeah, look, I think one of my observations is that sometimes an image or an object and a particular way of looking at it tends to get stuck, or we get stuck with that one view. So elevating the law busts was just a little bit of fun, some curatorial license, just to expose people to, everyone who knows those busts is used to looking directly into the eyes of Warady, but to look directly into the eyes of Truganini meant squatting down, an odd thing to do. It raises this really problematic question of, well, what was the intention of law? Did he intend for these things to be displayed in an elevated way? You can find plenty of places in the world. I've just come from Dublin, and the Trinity Library there are, if anyone who's been there will remember the lines of busts. They're all elevated to a similar height to the one that we displayed, the law busts in Canberra and Launceston. It gives people a different perspective and a different, as you say, emotional relationship. And I like that. I think it helps to deepen and diversify our perception of these objects and what they have to say to us.
Hi, my question's for Greg as well. I was wondering about the physical nature of these live casts being made, which I've heard a little bit about, I guess, and how that might have affected, I guess, the way these live casts are appearing and perceived from the point of view of a physically confronting sort of process and having to stay very still and having all sorts of physical sensations as is being made. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about how that affects the way they appear and the way they're perceived.
Yeah, this is a really important and fascinating question, and there's been a bit written about this. I don't know whether we've really got time to do it justice, but I can't remember Ian Terry, no, I can't remember the name of the author who commented that the process of taking the life masks or the impressions from living people that Dumoutier met with in his travels in the South Pacific would have required him to spend time with these people, maybe convince them somehow or another by their cooperation. There are records of him failing to obtain the cooperation and people walking out, not being prepared to do this. He may have also had access to people whose agency was compromised, and somehow or another they could be forced to comply with what he had to do. We don't know. The same question arises about particularly the photographs, the studio photographs by Charles Woolley of the Aboriginal people who from Oyster Cove. It's very easy to say, oh yes, this is the relations of power were such that these people had no choice. Well, it's too easy just to strip agency from those people and just cast them like Truganini is cast in that protest poster as an eternal victim. There may well have been interest that was served, interest by those people who sat for those photographs by doing so. There needs to be more work done on this subject, I think, because it's really that transaction between the sitter and the artist is essentially important.
Sorry, Greg, I just wanted to say also that that idea of the appropriation of the image after it's been used in its original context as well. And, for the use of Truganini's image for that particular poster, not what it was meant for, but certainly within a social and historical context, completely changes its meaning. Yeah.
Just 2 points. Firstly, I was very interested to see the installation shot from Launceston, which carried the impression of a mantelpiece. which is very much in keeping with contemporary. Remembering Mark's paper, first thing in this conference was that we started with the decorative arts, and that is very much the domestic setting in which a multiple like that would be likely to be displayed, which is at that height. The second point, and it probably could be asked of either of you, and that is that does the process of multiplication, whether it's through printmaking media or photographic media or casts like this, is that a necessary precursor to the kind of political discourses or aesthetic discourses? Do you have to have multiple things for the conversation to reach the level which it obviously did in relation to the David or to the Law busts?
That's a really good question, and it's worth a few papers that I'm sure people here could set to work on. I mean, my initial response to that is that there's a degree of, I guess, democratisation in terms of access to works by reproduction, particularly by publication of engravings. And just thinking back to Elisa's presentation yesterday about with those wonderful drawings by Piron, Petit. You know, people assume that it's the drawing or the watercolour that emerges from that voyage of exploration that is the really, really important thing. And sure, they might be attractive and colourful, but the really, really important thing, the ultimate product, is that engraved image for publication, to promulgate knowledge and understanding and offer experience to the readers of places where they are never in their, little humble lives ever going to be able to visit. So there is something really quite profound about that process of reproduction, and something quite anarchic in terms of the inability of the artist or even the publisher to control what then happens to those iterations of the work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Greg. I was just thinking about Michelangelo's casts and the multiplicity and the so many copies that we have, yet each of them, and each copy, and I dare say this is the same whether you're replicating photographs, prints, any particular media, each single copy that you make is always a little bit different from the original. And, and so it goes on. And also, using these copies in the context, I cannot ever imagine the original artist, in this case Michelangelo, would ever have imagined or would ever even have thought of his dusk, for example, to be taken as a single object away from the complex iconography of Lorenzo's tomb. So, it's meant to be read along with its counterpart, along with the figure of Lorenzo, not as just a single reclining figure, yet, this is what's happened to it 4 centuries after Michelangelo made it.
Can I just add to that? I mean, towards the end of your paper where you were talking about contemporary artists using the cast, I was put in mind of the Andrew Hazewinkle 12 Figures After Niccolo, the Donatello cast that was in the National recently. And that is not so much a discourse coming out of the multiplicity of caste, but a discourse of multiplicity coming out of anxiety, so coming out of the discourse and into the object, rather than out of the object and into the discourse.
Look, absolutely. One of the students I didn't have time to talk about is Ben Feslet, who's one of our MFA students at the moment, and his work is actually based on copying, multiplicity, and destruction at the end. And he makes constant, multiple copies of one object, which he said to me are the same but not the same. So each of them is slightly different, so that in his performance he can actually destroy some of those copies, which was also a very interesting practice considering the history of the destruction of casts in the late 1960s. And I'm thinking especially of the the student riots at the École des Beaux-Arts in the late 1960s, and certainly here at the art school too, there was also a period where the casts were destroyed. So even that performative act feeds back into the history of the actual object.
Can I just add a comment about on the subject of destruction? The response from at that meeting that the law busts should be destroyed, in some ways follows the response of the community through the process of repatriation of ancestral remains to the fact that not only are anatomical remains returned, bones, but plaster casts often come back from collecting institutions. And the community's response has always been that those plaster reproductions are burned in the cremation fire or reburied along with the bones. And it forces us to think about the life mask being created from something which is in the most intimate of contact with the body, and seems to therefore be imbued not just with this uncanny sense of likeness, but something more than that, that proceeds from an intellectual knowledge of how this is made. So the technique imbues some aesthetic and even spiritual quality to the object. I mean, this is kind of mind-numbing. I find it really quite, disturbing and confusing.
And I wanted to. I don't want to be the sort of annoying person who's just going back to the old, sort of post-colonial views. But hold on a second. There is a direct connection between the two kinds of modelling that you've been talking about, because obviously, I mean, we should not state it unclearly. The making of casts is related directly to the 19th century belief in canons which were formed out of the same intellectual material as racist views of, the non-Western versus the Western world, that these casts are not innocent trajectories sent by just to form artists. They're not. They are sent out freighted with the weight of kinds of theories of ideal beauty. They are whitened by their lack of polychromy, as we all know from Winckelmann onwards. They are straightened, they are beautified, they are then sent as missionaries of Western civilization. I'm sorry to use such a freighted term, but I do it deliberately, because when you, Greg, were talking about the consistent resonances in today's Australia of a certain kind of way of seeing ethnographically, or seeing ethnographically as kind of a disappeared civilization and versus a triumph, or one that should be triumphant, I can't help but see that in casts. Now, this does not mean, this is the reason why they were destroyed by the students in the École des Beaux-Arts. This was part of their understanding. And I suppose I want to say, how are we to respond to casts right now that are of this ilk? Because they're not just any old cast. They're made out of a canon that was then replicated and re-replicated. So, in other words, I suppose my question is, what is the ideological... You were brilliant, Greg, in describing the freight and the weight and the problem of the cast that you were talking about. But I think, Lorraine, there might be something to be said about the freight and weight and problem of the cast that you've been talking about. I mean, so I wondered if you had any comment on that.
Just very quickly about our own cast collection, I quite agree with you, Mark. Yes, they are. They are very redolent in the symbolism and the significance of the academic tradition, the Western cultural academic tradition, absolutely. And you're right, that is why the students rebelled and the Paris riots at the School of Beaux-Arts, and indeed why they were destroyed here. It was part of that academic tradition that students were trying to walk away from, trying to sweep away from. So, but I think they're being revalued at this particular time because they stand in also, yes, they are redolent with all of those, ideals, I guess, but they are also historic objects and very valuable historic objects. And I see also in the busts of Wiretti and Truganini as well, which I'm sure you didn't mention, Greg, but I'm sure you're quite aware of, the way that they've been clothed, the busts have been clothed, it's in almost very classical draping as well. So they're fitting right into those academic ideals as historic objects of the 19th century.
It's not an annoying observation at all. It's a really important observation. So many things to be said about this. One observation is that there was quite a different... Pierre de Moutier, the phrenologist who was brought along on the expedition by de Monteville, had very different views to de Monts. De Monts was much more inclined towards the polygenicist view of multiple races, which is arguably much more partial to a lot of what scientific racism and social Darwinism was drawn out to say in the late 19th and early 20th century. Whereas, and of course, if you read de Monts' journals, he says horrible things about Aboriginal people. He was not a fan. Whereas de Moutier is much more reserved. He's still operating within that ideological environment. But, I suspect that de Monts was much more partial to the views of Hume and Voltaire than de Moutier was. And the other thing I'll say, I think, is that, and I'll get back to this idea of renovation. Yes, everything that you say is absolutely important, but I think there's some freedom in being able and feeling empowered to say, you know what, yeah, we know all of that, but there are some things about these images that we want to define, and we don't want to have to be slaves to counter-narrative all the time. We want to be able to actually say stuff which is original and creative and expressive of our passions. And my passion is, I want to see the beauty of Truganini. I want to see her strength and her agency. And I don't want to see her cast as a victim, even though, and I don't really think that Woolley was taking photos of somebody in that mode either. But yeah, really important questions. And I hesitate to use the word decolonising, but because it's such a horribly overused and poorly framed term. But maybe there's some... there was an example I had in my head before it's gone. Maybe there's an opportunity to decolonise these objects and these images so that we're not always operating within what Jim Everett calls the colonial dome. What is there outside of the response and reaction to colonisation? What there is Indigenous creativity and agency, and yeah.
I'm so sorry. I think we need to wrap up. We have afternoon tea for you, and as